welcome everyone. So we have a listing of questions here to get through. There's about 10. Rather than sort of getting too bogged down and going through question by question, from past experience, that sometimes leads to, missing a whole section. Instead, we're sort of going to tackle it by area. So initially, we'll just tackle these first three questions: technology used to perpetrate fraud. You've got the questions in front of you. It was in the handout that we gave you, when you signed up. But maybe just briefly, I'll just highlight what was in those questions. So, and feel free just to come in on any point on any of these three questions. Hanken's going to be taking notes for us, and then we'll just do a brief summary back to the roundtable when we come back to it. So the first question was, what types of recent technology utilized by companies have created new vulnerabilities and fraud risks that auditors should consider when identifying and assessing risks of material misstatement due to fraud? So our second question is about technologies used by fraudsters to perpetrate fraud, either from inside or outside the company. And lastly, what challenges does technology present in the landscape of fraud detection in today's environment? So basically, all three of these are under the heading of technology used to perpetrate fraud. So if anyone would like to begin, we can use the hands up function. It's a fairly small group, so we might be able to get away without it. But if you maybe just, at least initially, let's start with people using the hands up function, which is just, trying to remember where it is if you're not me, but it should be a little button you can press that says raise hand. You might have to open the participants panel in order to do so. And then you'll see it just at the bottom of the participants panel. Okay, Naoto, apologies, am I saying your name correctly?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So I'm gonna volunteer the first person to speak. So when it comes to the technology used to penetrate the fraud, I think there are some cases where the fraudsters can take advantage of the situation of the changing in the technologies used in the entity. So for example, the companies start using the optimization or prediction techniques for the accounting estimates. There are a lot of the areas you can manipulate. I mean, the companies can manipulate so that when we think of the fraud risk, like the algorithm or the input can be manipulated so that when the optimization or prediction techniques are prevailing, I think there'll be more risks to leverage that techniques. And also, when the companies are leveraging the techniques like blockchain or other techniques, I think auditors need to be kind of aware of the where risk comes from. So like even if the blockchain is implemented as a part of the internal control, still there are some risks blockchain doesn't cover, so that the auditors need to know where the risk comes from. For example, if the input is inappropriately made, there's a wrong information in the blockchain, and then it's going to be difficult to change later. So that the auditors need to be aware of where the risk comes from to respond to the what could go wrong. And also, like when the company start building the in-house application for the part of the controls, again, auditors needs to be aware of where the risk comes from. I mean, like if they take the agile method to develop the software and revise the software so frequently, then the software application control can change in a frequent way, like a daily basis or more frequent than before, so that the auditors need to think about the audit strategy for the application control testing. That's the area where I think the vulnerability I can come up with. And when it comes to the challenges the technology present in the landscape of fraud detection in today's environment, I think like the auditor's knowledge or literacy is the challenging things. So sometimes the auditors are not necessarily familiar with the data analytics, and then sometimes client communication is made by audit teams, rather data analytics expert, and in that case, it is very hard to talk with the IT department in the client side to ask for the right data to analyze. So that's a kind of a challenging area, no matter how the technology is developed and how analytics is advanced. The auditors in the field needs to be aware, familiar with the techniques. And also, even if the analytics is used, the evidence is, if the evidence is forged or counterparties conspire together, it is hard for the auditors to identify the fraudulent evidence. So that that is also difficult. Even if analytics tool shows the signs, it doesn't necessarily lead to the actual evidence. So that's the points from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Either just by waving at me or using the hands up function, can you just indicate if anyone wants to pick up on any of those thoughts? Okay, Kai, I see you, and then Laura straight after.
Thank you. Let me share with the perspective that the authorities should have regarding the use of technology in flight, if I may. With regard to the use of new technologies in financial statement audit, in my view, there are various possible ways of utilizing the aspects involved in identifying fraud risk. For example, use of IT for comprehensive check of population data, use of IT for group audit, use of IT for analysis methods such as visualization of abnormal points, and use of IT for accounting estimate. I would like to share 4 issues that must be considered as a supervisory authority. First, I would say that we must promote the use of technology in supervision methods. When investigating of financial statements, we think that it may be possible to use AI for the purpose of streamlining procedures and enriching descriptive information that is useful to investors. Second, in order to improve the accuracy of these analyses, it is necessary not only for the auditors to respond, but also for the audit company to accept the use of new technology for audits. For example, it may be necessary to deal with the entire ecosystem of financial reporting, such as audit data standards. Third, we welcome the effective approach to address fraud risks through the use of new technology. However, from the enforceability perspective, ensuring reproducibility of audit procedures is important. It is important for auditors to fully understand the mechanism and conduct effective audits by avoiding black boxes in procedures due to the use of AI. Fourth, regarding events that may affect the auditor's judgment as an expert, such as automation bias due to excessive reliance on technology, it is necessary to deal with soft issues such as education. Finally, I would also like to mention the cooperation with international organizations on information sharing. This is a topic of high interest in the working group that discusses law enforcement at IFIAL. In the future, it may be possible to have an opportunity for discussion with those interested subcommittees. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Laura, over to you.
Well, great, thank you very much. I was just going to say, I think it's a really important point that was touched on earlier about the need for auditors and those of us doing investigations, which is much more my background, to really have those technical skills to keep up with the technology that's being used, certainly by the fraudsters. I think David said in his session right at the beginning about how we need to have the same tools in our kind of arsenal as the fraudsters have in theirs. And I think that's something that's not always straightforward to keep up to date and be, timely enough to have the right skills that they have. And I think that's sort of another thing that happens with the new technologies is just the speed at which everything takes place. You know, if you're conducting an investigation or an audit after the fact, is it timely enough to catch those issues, or are we too late already by then because of the speed at which everything's taking place, I suppose. So I just wanted to add that from my perspective.
Sure. Laura, maybe just on your last point there. So when you say speed, do you mean speed because there's a financial reporting process and therefore you've only got a limited window, or do you mean because the fraud's already taken place and you're playing catch up already?
So I mean the second of those actually. You know, the nature of an audit is that it is after the event. And I think that possibly moving more towards real-time audit and seeing what we can do on a continual monitoring basis is actually maybe much more useful for those kind of fraud points or misconduct, corruption issues, and waiting for a year or so afterwards and trying to work out what happened. So yes, I meant that.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for that, Laura. I'm thinking that we probably have about 10 minutes on each one of these sections. So we've probably still got another minute or two on this section if anyone wants to make another comment. Lynn?
I was just going to follow on Laura's point. So again, I have a forensic background as well, but thinking in terms of the skill sets required. So when new technologies are used in companies, whether an auditor understands, you know, what are the functions that could be turned on or turned off for that proactive monitoring as well. In many of our investigations, we find that there are logs and tools that the software has that maybe a company doesn't know. They can turn those functions on so that they can track potential access of unwanted people, either inside or threats or external. So having the ability or having someone on your team that has that technology expertise, or even bring in an external consultant as part of your audits, would help to understand that otherwise a kind of a financial accountant might not understand those limitations of the software.
Okay, wonderful. Maybe let's just seamlessly merge into the next section for discussion. And I appreciate these conversations do blur a little bit between them. So the second section is on technology used by auditors. And the questions here are really around how people are using technology to perform fraud procedures in financial statement audits. What emerging technologies do you foresee being used? And what challenges does technology present in responding to fraud risks in today's environment? So, you know, perhaps we've covered some of these points already, but perhaps there's some additional points that people would like to bring out. Mark?
Thank you, Brett, and I can probably help with the transition as well between the two topics there, hopefully. I think one of the things from my perspective I'd like to share, and it talks to almost the lack of use of technology sometimes across this process, is that a lot of times we hear, and we've already heard earlier today, some of the great examples of what people can do when they get hold of data and they can start to visualize and interpret it and start to apply all these different techniques, which, to be quite honest, a lot of them have been around for many, many years. And, you know, while we might have made some incremental improvements on journal entry testing, I think talking about journal entry testing is quite dated. One of the things that I think that we need to place a bit more focus on in terms of fraud is around some of the dated processes or the ways that technology isn't used throughout that transition between the client accounting system or the accounting system we're looking to really query, and the tools and technologies that we, the auditor or the forensic accountant, it's actually really interesting hearing Laura and Lynn share their views on this, actually how they then analyze that data. And one of the things that people always seem to miss in this process is that often fraudsters are involved in preparing and providing the data that's going to be analyzed. And I use a simple example of, we so prevalently use like reporting extracts from accounting systems that we run into Excel. I'm the financial controller, I export into Excel. There's nothing stopping me just deleting the things that I don't want you to see before I send it across to you. And I can see Lynn smiling because it's ridiculous. It's a joke, right? But it actually is how so much of this is flawed. So I think, to be honest, one of the things that frustrates me a little bit is we focus so much on what the technology can do in terms of the analysis and the interrogation of the data. We completely miss where technology could play a broader role around the integrity and the diligence of the data that we're actually getting in the first instance. So just to transition those two topics, I think that fraudsters actually like us not using technology in certain parts of the process, certainly in terms of that preparing and curation of the data. And I think that sometimes our focus can be not across the end-to-end process that we really need to think about when we're thinking about fraud risk.
Thanks for that. I'm just catching up on some note-taking.
It's okay, I like to throw a lot of things at you in one go because I'm going to let everybody else have a fair share of the airtime.
That's okay. I'm just a compulsive note-taker at these things. Not that I don't trust Henkin, but always for my own benefit as well. Len, let's turn to you for a moment.
I was going to address this point more of a challenge for the auditors versus finding a good solution for them. But in terms of one of the differences, I think, between forensic investigations and on audit and trying to identify issues is, from a forensic perspective, there's usually been an issue, so we have a much more specific target and can scope things out a little differently. When you look at using different analytical software to help identify certain red flags for an audit, it's often there isn't anything specific you're looking at. You know, I'm not conducting audits, but I know that there's nothing specific. You're looking for kind of a broad range of potential risks rather than a known risk. And oftentimes there isn't great baseline activity to match against outliers for that. So I think, you know, when a company takes on analytics and begins to do it, year over year, the data will get better and the scenario building will get better to help identify those red flags. But there is quite a challenge from an audit perspective because, you know, you're not approaching it with a specific risk in mind. You're just trying to identify where those heightened risks exist, and it needs to be material as well. From a forensic perspective, we don't often look at materiality, it's more risk-based. And so if audits can change and really help to drive towards that risk-based approach, that I think, to Laura's point of being real-time, looking at it, it offers that relevance to what's going on. So it's more like a challenge. I think analytics are being used to identify certain things, but just the general challenge from, you know, that broad range of what auditors look at and what we're really targeting on. So it's a little easier and not for us.
Okay, thanks for that, Len. Len Dewey.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just reflecting on, you know, Laura and Lynn and Mark's input. I think those are very valuable. In preparing for this session, I actually spoke to a couple enforcement staff at the, you know, securities regulators, and I think all of you brought a good point. I think one of them is the real-time audit, continuous audit, because the volume of data and technology moving so fast, and some of the enforcement cases they've seen is you're basically committing fraud on top of fraud and accumulate over a period of time. By the time you go do an audit, you actually really gets lost in terms of what you're focusing on. And it goes back to, you know, Mark's point about integrity of data. I think in some of the cases I was told by the regulator that you know, sometimes if you look at CFO, controller, financial reporting, they get feed the data to them. And sometimes, you know, the fraud are committed in another department, actually feeding into the financial reporting department. So, you know, auditors are so focused on, you know, financial statement audit in accordance with accounting principles, and you have, you know, Lynn mentioned about materiality and try to do your coverage and sampling. And a lot of times you actually miss the boat. So the scope is actually broader, you know, in terms of the source of data. You know, others talk about you know, through assumption, through, you know, accounting estimate, you can manipulate data. But some of the source documents, the source transaction of the data actually has been manipulated at the very beginning before you get to finance department. So that's one. And I know we're not talking about expectation gap, but I think Lynn made an excellent comment, is maybe for a different discussion, is you know, a current assurance model on financial statement audit is actually meeting the expectation of the the investor of today, because the audit assurance framework developed 50 years ago. It kind of evolved. The profession is adverse changing, adverse changes. But I think with the environment and the amount of fraud, the sophistication of fraud, as audit standards that perhaps this is something we can look into. Maybe it's not just the fraud standards. Maybe it's a whole suite of standards we need to catch up. And Lynn made an excellent point about risk-based approach. But the risk-based approach, it requires mindset change. It requires traditional way of doing audits, and people keep looking for significance, materiality. So that whole aspect of training and catching up to the demand of current investors' mindset in terms of whether audit is still actually relevant, or is it the market or public interest that we need to look into something more of a more forensic audit going forward. But at least from what I'm seeing is continuous audit is one option. Then the other one is maybe higher level assurance. But I think from what I heard so far, it kind of reinforced some of these things I heard from the regulators.
Thanks, Len. That's very helpful. And I'm picking up a general theme about the importance of data integrity, which is interesting because it's coming in from some other sources as well that we're hearing constantly about, that auditors need to spend a little bit more time on data integrity. Not to say that they're not doing it at the moment, but also, and this hasn't so much come out of this one, but just for people's interest, one of the interesting questions we've been looking at is how much of this is actually would benefit enormously from data standardization. Auditors spend way too much time trying to get the data into a format that they can apply a tool to, and at the moment that's a fairly unproductive use of their time and could be helped enormously if people adhered to data standards. James, I saw your hand. I'll call on you just because you haven't spoken yet. We are running a little bit out of time for this section, but I still see Naoto and Kai still want to speak, and Laura as well. So let's see how we go with time. James, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Brett. Well, to me, that's then directly related to internal controls. And to me, that, Mark alluded to this, the controls over the transfer of the data and so forth. And I really think, that's at the heart of it. And if you look at a number of large mergers which take place, which aren't always successful, then the time it takes some of these organizations to utilize the benefits, they have claimed in economies of scale and putting the systems together, sometimes that leads to problems, and it has certainly in the UK over the years led then to manipulation of financial statements on occasion. So I really think controls is very, very important. I would also ask the question, given where we're going with technology and data, large companies which continue to operate systems which don't speak to one another and so forth, is that not a red flag in itself? I do appreciate there's major costs in changing systems, but if you continue with that and you really are a true multinational looking to go forward in an environment where technology, really is pervasive, I really do question. And therefore I ask the question, is there more information that should be getting out to shareholders in terms of the controls which companies have in place and where they are in relation to some of their peers?
Thanks, James. Naoto.
Yes, so to the point about the integrity of the data, I also would like to add the additional view. In Japan, we run the anomaly detection tool based on the journal entry using the machine learning techniques. And then when we kind of developed the machine learning model for the anomaly detection tool, we are kind of facing some challenge about the combining the different clients' data sets. So from the confidentiality issues, we cannot combine the data set from different companies, so that we need to use the one specific company to build the prediction model or machine learning model one by one. So if there's some kind of the standard changing and combine the different companies' data set to build the one better model, maybe that changed the situation. And also, it is also challenging to share the actual fraud data set among the audit firms. So as one of the big four, we can kind of do some research about what's the root cause or how the data looks like in the real data set. But it's just for our firm, and we cannot kind of share that kind of the information with others. But if like academia or Big Fours or other audit firms can share the real fraud case, maybe we can build a better model to predict or identify the fraud case or fraud signs using the machine learning or whatever. So like sharing the information which is standardized and analyzed in the same way is a really big agenda we need to tackle. So that's one thing. And also, I would add another aspect from the audit standards point. So when the machine gives you the result of the anomaly detection, human sense and machine result, we need to prioritize which is we need to kind of trust. So sometimes the human auditors feel the machine result doesn't make sense. So that do we allow them to waive those results, or do we force them to investigate the result? Of course, they have the business knowledge and they have the sense of the risk, so that it is reasonable to let them kind of waive some journal entries generated from the machine. But on the other hand, they might miss some important journal entry or signs of the fraudulent. So we don't have the specific kind of rule or the idea of which one we should prioritize. But I think that might be one of the things we need to think about in the future when the machine learning techniques will be prevailing. So that's from my view. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Laura, I think I saw your hand at one point. Is that right?
Yes, thank you. I was just going to mention briefly the Bryden review that was conducted in the UK and published at the back end of last year. Just thinking one of the themes examined in that review is about, what more could auditors be doing in their external audits to find fraud, and what more should they be doing, etc. And so there's kind of a bigger question, isn't there, in the backdrop of all of this discussion about really the role of the external auditor in detecting fraud, and how far that should go. I just wanted to mention that. And one other thing was just thinking about the quality of data. So a lot of the work I do now is with donors and partners delivering in developing countries. And the quality of the data isn't necessarily what it might be in a big multinational that we've been discussing here. So I think there's also a grading system, isn't there, of how much one can even use technology because things aren't digitized, for example. So I just wanted to flag that too.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, we'll move on to our last section here. So it's technology used in forensic audits. And then there is one very last question, which we'll get to if we have a couple of minutes. In terms of technology used in forensic audits, what are the current trends you see in how frauds are being perpetrated using evolving technologies? How is technology being used in forensic audits? I know we've touched on a couple of points already. And what emerging technologies do you foresee being used in the near future? So let me just open it back up again. Either wave to me or you can put your hand up electronically, whichever works. Lynn?
I just, on that topic, I think, and it was covered by Paul as well, I wanted to touch on the move from a forensic piece of using technology is technologies that are starting to combine a lot more data now from different sources. So it used to be in a forensic aspect, you'd look at emails and then you'd look at, transactional data, and then that was a bit standalone, but there's some tools that now can leverage, different intake where you can start layering on different data to give you better insights, which I think as we move toward that artificial intelligence, the data is just going to get better and better coming out of that. Just for example, we've got a client in an insurance and they're, completely virtual, and we're able to look at open source intelligence, corporate registries, litigation, past frauds potentially, and link that to transactional data, internal investigations that the company might have done. And so as the data speaks to each other, it has many more data points to connect. And that's what we're seeing, the real use of technology, the ability to layer on multiple data sources to get to that real artificial intelligence that should be more helpful to investigations.
Thanks. That's very helpful. Who would like to follow on? Shipley Smith, we haven't heard from you yet, and unfortunately I can't see your video, so I'm not sure if you're there or not. But if you did have something you wanted to add, now would be a suitable time.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I was on mute, but no, I would echo the majority of the group's comments. I mean, I think the quality of the data is something that we obviously focus on and push as part of our solution at Confirmation, and I do see moves into more continuous auditing, and in terms of standardizing the data, I think we're keeping a close eye on things like open banking that can provide more real-time transactional data, and specifically getting access to data from the source. I mean, I think most of the frauds we see, at least at Confirmation, are coming from client-provided documentation and maybe a lack of potentially due diligence to investigate that data further when there are anomalies, because the fraudsters are obviously very good at making things tie out on paper, and it's kind of having that skepticism and doing that additional due diligence to go a little further. But I do think progression in those types of technologies like open banking will definitely aid in a lot of that.
Thanks for that, Shipley. Any other last comments on this forensic audit piece? Otherwise, we might just move on to our very, very last question. Laura?
Thank you. I was just reflecting on the shift towards using more and more unstructured data in investigations. I think when I first did my training, we had to review all our emails manually to find the keywords we wanted. Whereas now a lot of that can be done by machines and they learn on their own. And I'm just thinking about having text and having speech and having video, and the extent to which we can use computer technology to analyze those for us and pull threads together. I mean, it's quite exciting really for my profession to think about all of those things coming through.
Absolutely, thanks for that, Laura. Okay, let's move on to our last question, which is what other information or research related to technology used to perpetrate or detect fraud should the IAASB consider in determining the nature and extent of any possible future actions on this topic? So we've talked about a lot of things already in terms of data analytics, AI, machine learning, but I guess what we're probably looking for from this question is there something that we're missing? Or something that, at a very granular level you think is very important that we really make sure is front and center in what we're doing. Lynn?
I would just echo what James mentioned before about companies not investing and not taking on the investment of the data. And as Laura mentioned too, you've got very unsophisticated clients and sophisticated clients, but if we could somehow figure out a way to move more of the clients into that more technology driven, or if you make it there's levels of requirements to automate, it would become easier for the auditors to do that kind of work, and on both sides I guess creates more opportunities for fraudsters, but it would also create a better proactive monitoring experience for the client as well. But it's the old adage, it's garbage in, garbage out, or unstructured data, and you can only do what you have access to. So I don't know, maybe some thought around how you motivate clients a little bit more into that technology driven data.
Okay, thanks for that, Lynn. James?
Yeah, Brett, building on that, if you looked at the risk register in the UK 2 years ago, the top two risks were a pandemic, and we all know what's happened there, and cybersecurity. And really where I'm going is, how does the cybersecurity measures which a company has in place link to the audit? If someone can break into a large corporation and then cause severe reputational damage, and the auditors just signed off the audit report as a going concern, there is a possibility it may no longer be a going concern. So going forward, I just wonder what the expectations will be in relation to where does cybersecurity fit in to the financial statement audit or some related assurance product, because it is absolutely vital.
So according to the clock in the top of my screen, we still have about 4 minutes to go. So any last comments or questions, anything you really had a burning desire to share during this breakout session? So Len Dewey, I saw your hand go up. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you. I thought all the inputs are great. So we're setting up this working group to look at fraud, and so I'm going to be spending the next 2 years on this. So I just want to say a lot of information I heard today are very useful. But in terms of the last question is, what are the information and research related to technology used to perpetrate fraud and detect fraud we should be doing? So it would be good to hear from the panelists, and also maybe not today, but going forward as we progress, is what role can the IAASB play? Because we're a standard setter, right? So we're setting standards. Sometimes some of the technology issues are so specific, and also it keeps evolving, and standard need to fit for purpose over a period of time. So if we write something related to technology, by the time we're done with the standards, will be probably outdated already. So whether there's something maybe we can more proactive in terms of staff guidance, or other form of documents we can issue from the board, because writing a standard takes 3 or 4 years, and it's not helpful. So this is something that maybe perhaps with the help of the panelists and also we as a IAASB and staff, maybe we should talk to more people about more research in terms of what we can do within the confine of this project, whether it's revising ISO 240 to address overall fraud, the trend, and what additional technique we use. But this technology piece will be a challenge for standard setters. So it would be helpful for people in practice to continue to give us a good point and comments and suggestions as we progress with the project.
Yeah, Len, I think that's a very good point there. There is an element to which we have to wait for technology to be implemented and somewhat widely available before a standard setter can do very much with it, because otherwise, our standards operate in 130 countries. So, we need a fairly widespread adoption before we can go too far. That's a great point, Len. James, I see that hand.
Thanks, Brett. Yeah, Len, I would just like to know what sort of discussions will take place with investors, because ultimately they are the party paying for these audits. And what will they want going forward? Because obviously there'll have to be a trade-off, because we can't have an audit that will just cost, substantially more. But I do think there'll be value in having discussions with investor groups around the globe to try and gauge where do they want to go in relation to increased detection of fraud, and how much are they willing to pay in relation to that. And indeed, are there other areas that they would prefer the auditor's time to be spent? And the other point I'd just like to make is, from an IAASB perspective, the one issue that does spring to mind here is, when people are looking at emails and so forth, would there be any confidentiality concerns if some of it wasn't business related? Now, I'm assuming these are all business emails and so forth, which have been checked in relation to the unstructured data. But would there be any possibility of any privacy confidentiality concerns just coming to light? And I'm just flagging it, I don't know.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your time. It's been great sharing this little virtual space with you.